Welcome. We're glad you joined us for our worship here at the Meaford Church of Christ. A couple of quick announcements. Then we'll have the Lord's table. And finally, the lesson. As always, you can skip to the lesson using the timestamp down in the description. Very simple announcement today, just to let you know, we are meeting here in the building. We do have some restrictions still in place, such as wearing masks, but things are starting to get back to normal. So if you're here in town watching this and you've not yet come to join us on Sunday morning, I would welcome you to do that. The other thing is, if you're watching this and not able to be here, we want to hear from you. We want to know that you're watching, and we want to know what needs you may have. So if you need prayers, if you need to talk to someone, if there are things going on in your life that you want expressed to the congregation, please let us know so that we can be taking those needs to our Heavenly Father in prayer and be looking for ways that we can serve you in various ways. So those are the announcements. I'd remind you again, check your bulletin and a reminder of our men's and ladies classes. The ladies are still meeting through Zoom. The men have been meeting in person at the building and will continue to do so. And probably in the not too distant future, in fact, not probably, for sure in the not too distant future, we will transition to going back to our regular Wednesday night meeting the way we were before COVID. All right, so be looking forward to that and for an announcement along those lines. I would next invite you to do whatever you need to do at your house, whether you're going to sing some songs, whether you are needing to prepare or get some emblems ready, whatever you need to do at your house to partake of the Lord's table, please pause the video and do that now. Now that you're back, having been prepared for the Lord's table, I would like to read from Matthew chapter 26, a very familiar passage, one that we often read with the Lord's table, and I'm going to read it for you now. Matthew chapter 26, beginning in verse 26. Now as they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after blessing it, broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink of it, all of you. For this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink again of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." And as we drink it new in the Father's kingdom, we ought to do what he said. Remember the sacrifice, remember the teaching, and among those things, remember who we are, the change that has been initiated in our lives because of the sacrifice of Christ, the avenue that was opened into his body, the access to God, the forgiveness of sins, all of these things achieved through the work of Christ ought to be on our hearts and on our minds as we partake of the bread representing his body and the fruit of the vine representing his shed blood. And so I hope that's helpful to you as we reflect at this time on our Savior and on his work. You know, it has often been the case in world history, and it's certainly the case now, that we are experiencing times of turmoil, of trouble. There are things that are on our hearts and minds. There are loved ones who we're concerned about. There are wars taking place. There are new and scary and troubling stories every day of problems that our world and our loved ones and even us in our own lives are facing. We hear something more about Russia almost daily, and none of it seems to be good news. For many, this past week, we had the passing of a good friend and a sister in Christ, and our prayers continue to be with the Thompson and Baker family. Gas prices are rising. Inflation is increasing. Provincial politicians are going into election mode and telling us all kinds of things, promises and solutions. You know, they're pretending to be concerned about, you know, the price that people are paying for things and the challenges they face in life. And so, you know, politicians will do all of that. Plus, we're waiting for the other shoe to drop. You know, we are starting to see some lifting of restrictions for COVID, but we've been through this before. And so we're beginning to go, okay, can I make plans to meet with my family for some event? If I'm a business owner, can I open my business and bring patrons in, or am I going to be shut down? Can I invest in capital that I'm going to use to serve those patrons, or is that going to be a wasted investment? Maybe it's just can I go to a restaurant with my friends? And so we're in a time that is tumultuous, where things are changing, where things are on our minds, and we're not sure in every case what tomorrow will bring. And so I want to take a few minutes this morning and remind you of some others who lived in tumultuous times, and ask you, as we think about these various ones that we're going to look at, these examples that we'll give, what was it? What was the characteristic? What was the guiding influence? What was the strengthening, encouraging factor in their lives that allowed them to face even the most daunting of circumstances and carry on? Perhaps we think of a man who lived in a time when the world was so wicked, so evil, that God himself described people this way: every thought and intention of their heart was on evil continually. Maybe some of you think that's today, but I dare say we're not to that point at all. I want to ask you, if that was your circumstance, what would you do? Maybe that's been your circumstance. Maybe you've been put in a life situation where the people around you were not good people, and they were trying to exert a not good influence on you. And if you haven't been there, I promise you, you will be. What would you do? I wonder if you'd try to share God's truth. Because the man I'm thinking of is a man that in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5, he was called a preacher of righteousness. Noah, of course, ultimately obeyed God even in building an ark, further drawing the ridicule and scoffing of his neighbors. So there's a man who lived in a rather tumultuous, difficult, contrary time. What about another young man who lived in a time of change? He was a favored son, loving parents, but jealous siblings. His brothers betrayed him and sold him into slavery. I wonder if he was worried about how that would turn out. I wonder if he missed his mom and dad. I wonder if he thought he would see them again. Then he goes to be a slave, and his owner's wife assaults him and then blames him, which ends up with him being imprisoned. Surely at that point he knew things were pretty bad. But he did, it says, have some hope that perhaps some of the friends he met in prison, would come through for him. Because friends you meet in prison are always upstanding, reliable people who you can really count on, right? Of course, eventually, one of them did. And they told the king about this man who could interpret dreams. And so this gives him an audience with the king who had had a dream. And in that dream, Joseph, of course, tells Pharaoh that he's being warned about a famine that's coming and how he needs to prepare for it. And so Joseph is put in charge of that preparation. And through his position is able to bring his whole family, rescue them from the famine, and put them in a secure situation in Egypt where they can grow into a great nation. What about What about the boy who seemed to have all the advantages? A noble family of good repute, a good education, a bright future, no doubt. However, while he was still a teenager, his country was invaded by a foreign army. His city of Jerusalem was sacked. And being well educated and from a noble family, he was viewed as an asset to the invading nation. And so he was taken to Babylon, where he'd be trained as an advisor and an educator. To fill a role that probably today we most commonly think of as wise men, although that sometimes that word has some baggage that can be difficult as well. This was for sure an opportunity, but nonetheless, as a young boy, to see everything you know destroyed, to be taken away from your home and your family, and to be transplanted into a new situation where you're essentially put in like maybe a boarding school would be the way we might think about it, where you're put into this training program to be prepared for a life of service to the king. Now, he was hardworking, he's conscientious, he's faithful, and of course, because of this, he excelled in this role. But because of his attitude, because of his conscientiousness, he was also a target. His co-workers were jealous. They didn't appreciate him overshadowing them. Further, he was viewed as a foreigner, and the expectation, in fact, the training that he was involved in was to culturally turn him into a Babylonian, and yet he refused, which again didn't help his social situation. Instead, he continued to follow the practices that he'd learned at home and to follow God to the best of his ability well on foreign soil. Eventually, they plotted to kill him. And you know the story. They threw him into a pen of lions. Even though he was favored by the king, there was a devious plot there to kill him, to get rid of him. Through Daniel, the truths of God were shared with Babylonian and Persian authorities. And although we're not directly told this, I often wonder if Daniel had some role in the eventual return of the Jews from captivity. Certainly, he had an influence that seemed to reach down over hundreds of years as some of his lineage, those people serving as Babylonian Eastern wise men many years later came looking for the Jewish Messiah. And I don't think I'm stretching too much to suggest that it was likely the influence of Daniel that caused that to be the case. What about the women, Mary and Martha, who welcomed an itinerant preacher, who invited him and his followers into their home, who showed them hospitality, who supported their ministry, who listened to his teaching and even became his friend, such that when they suffered, he suffered with them. These same women reached out to Jesus when their brother became ill. We know, of course, that Lazarus didn't survive his illness. He passed away and was dead when Jesus and his disciples arrived in Bethany. However, we also know that Jesus continued and raised Lazarus from the dead. But as I think about that, I think about, imagine then the confusion, the frustration, the sorrow when this Jesus, who they know can raise the dead, is arrested and tried and crucified. And it's important to keep in mind that Bethany, there where they lived, is only 2 miles from Jerusalem. Right? It's not like this was all happening to their friend far away where they, were only hearing, rumors about it. They were right there. If we continue moving, we can think of a woman that I heard about named Susan, who traveled to be an English teacher in Japan. And while there as an English teacher, established a Sunday school and started teaching children the gospel. Not only children, but teaching those children to share the truths they were learning with their parents. Susan continued to work in Japan as she aged. And eventually, as she became an older woman, her family said, "It's time to retire. Why don't you come home to America?" But she said, I need to keep working. And in fact, as she became older and began to struggle with illness, they said, "Look, you've got to come home where we can care for you and we can be with you." And she explained to her family that it was just as close to heaven from Japan as it was from America. And continued her work until she finally did pass away, still in Japan. What about a man named Slavic who needs our prayers? I'm going to roll a picture in here so you can see him preaching, just like many preachers are going to be doing on many Sundays. But there's a slight difference because Slavic is preaching in the Ukraine. And there's another picture I'd like to share, and that is of Angelina. She heard Slavic's preaching. She's being baptized in the Ukraine. The world indeed is a place of turmoil and often wickedness and cruelty. As Christians, we can sometimes struggle to know, how do we respond to these challenges? How do we deal with the worry and fear? How do we face those scary situations that come to us in the night when we can't sleep? Paul, in facing his own trouble, wrote in 2 Timothy chapter 1 that he knew whom he'd believed in and was persuaded that he was able to keep that which was committed to him until that day. Jesus warned us that we'd have trouble in the world, but further encouraged us not to be fearful because he's overcome the world. The songwriter told us faith is the victory that overcomes the world. I want to read a passage from Hebrews before we get to the passage from which I've drawn my title today. In Hebrews chapter 11, beginning in verse 32. Now, the whole rest of the chapter has been a long list, and I would encourage you to go ahead and read it and be reminded of more individuals than I can bring up in a few minutes. But let me read beginning in verse 32 of Hebrews chapter 11. What more shall I say? Time would fail me to tell you of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouth of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and dens and caves of the earth. The title today comes from the book of Habakkuk. And when Habakkuk was told the worst news of his life, that his people were going to be punished for their sinfulness, that everything he knew and loved would be destroyed by Babylon. God comforted him with two key messages. And I would say these two messages can be traced throughout the examples that we have looked at over the last few minutes. God said to Habakkuk, "The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him." God was saying to Habakkuk is that indeed, even at the very worst of times, when we cannot see a glimmer of light through the darkness, we need to remember that God still rules. And that if we are going to find a way through that darkness, if we're going to survive the challenges and the hardship, the second key is that the righteous shall live by faith. How do we make it? We make it by trusting God and remaining true to him and his word. And so when we face challenging, difficult times, when we face tragedies, when we face mistreatment from those who we trust, when we face difficulty, when we see the consequences of sin being played out in the lives of people we love, when we ourselves fall short and struggle, we need to remember those truths that God shared with Habakkuk in his moment of doubt. That God rules and that we must trust him.